You think you know what cruelty is? You have no idea. My name is Sarah McKenna, and for 3 years I was a Henderson. I married into the most powerful family in Clearwater Junction, and for 6 months after my husband James died, I was their charity case, their burden, their punching bag. It all came to a head on an August afternoon so hot the devil himself would have been looking for shade. They called me into the backyard. Martha Henderson, my mother-in-law, stood in the center of her children like a spider in her web. Her face, carved from prairie dust and spite, was twisted into a sneer. "You think you can just stay here?" she hissed, her voice cutting through the buzzing flies. "Living off our goodwill?" I tried to stand tall. "I've earned my keep, Martha. I've worked every single day." Her son, Thomas, spat a stream of tobacco juice that sizzled in the dust near my worn shoes. "Work? You call mending socks work? A real woman would have given my brother a son, an heir." The words hit me like a fist to the gut. 3 times I had lost a child before it could draw breath. 3 private, silent heartbreaks. And they were using them as a weapon against me, in public, because a crowd was gathering, neighbors, church folk, people I'd smiled at just last Sunday. They were peering over the fence posts, drawn to the drama, their eyes wide with a hungry sort of pity. "Please," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I have nowhere else to go." Martha's thin lips curled. It was the cruelest smile I'd ever seen. "Should have thought of that before you proved yourself useless." She let the silence hang in the air for a moment, savoring her power. Then she gave the order that would change everything. "Strip her." The words didn't even register at first. They were too monstrous, too unreal. "What?" I breathed. "You heard me," she snapped. "Everything you're wearing, we paid for. The dress, the shoes, the stockings. It's all Henderson property. You came to us with nothing. You'll leave the same way." Her daughters, Emma and Catherine, moved toward me. Their faces were grim masks, their eyes avoiding mine. They were farm girls, strong and merciless. "You can't," I begged, looking wildly at the crowd. At Reverend Garrett's wife, who clutched her shawl tighter. At the Whelan boys, who were already snickering. "This isn't Christian." Thomas stepped forward, his shadow falling over me. "A barren woman who failed her husband has no right to speak of God's will." The girls grabbed my arms. I struggled, but it was hopeless. I was trapped. The first button on my dress came undone. Then the second. The blue calico dress, the one James had bought me, pooled at my feet. The petticoat followed. "Even her underthings," Martha commanded, her voice ringing with triumph. Humiliation burned hotter than the sun. I squeezed my eyes shut, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break completely. I could hear the gasps from the crowd, a few nervous laughs. Someone whispered, "Frontier justice." When they finally stepped back, a cold breeze hit my skin. I stood there, in the middle of my own backyard, with nothing left. My arms wrapped around myself, a useless shield against 100 staring eyes. The red dust caked my bare feet. "There," Martha declared, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "Now everyone sees you for what you really are. Nothing." She was right. I was nothing, stripped not just of my clothes, but of my home, my name, my dignity. "Now get off our land," Thomas snarled. I forced my legs to move. Each step was an agony. The ground burned. The eyes of the townspeople felt like physical blows. Mrs. Palmer, the storekeeper's wife, turned her face away in shame. Or maybe it was disgust. I couldn't tell. I made it 20 yards down the path that led to the main street, a living spectacle of ruin. Where could I go? What could I do? My life was over. And that's when the world fell silent. The whispers, the snickers, the murmuring, it all stopped, cut off like a candle flame in the wind. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. Through the gap strode a figure that seemed to block out the sun. He was a mountain of a man, tall and broad, with a face weathered like old rock and eyes the color of a winter sky. I knew who he was. Everyone knew of Elias Boone, the hermit rancher from the far valleys, a man who came to town twice a year, spoke to no one, and left a trail of dark rumors in his wake. He swung down from his massive horse, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at the Hendersons. He looked at the gawking crowd. Then his eyes landed on me. He said nothing. He just shrugged off his long, heavy duster coat, walked straight toward me, and wrapped it around my shoulders. It fell to my ankles, heavy and warm, smelling of sage and leather. It felt like armor. I clutched it closed, my body shaking uncontrollably. Boone turned to face the Hendersons. The silence was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. Thomas's hand twitched toward his pistol, then froze. Then Elias Boone looked down at me, and his voice, when it finally came, was as deep and final as thunder rolling in from the mountains. "You're coming with me." The words echoed in the stunned silence. "You're coming with me." Thomas Henderson finally found his voice, his face turning a blotchy red. "Now wait just a minute, Boone. You can't just—" Elias Boone didn't even look at him. He just stood there, a granite statue of a man, and his sheer presence was enough to make Thomas choke on his own words. There was no threat in his posture, but the danger was there all the same, coiled and waiting. This was not a man you crossed. "This is family business," Martha Henderson snapped, though the venom in her voice was diluted with a new, unfamiliar hint of fear. "The woman was our responsibility." "Was," Boone repeated. The single word was a death sentence to my old life. His winter sky eyes swept over the crowd, and person after person looked away, ashamed. "Not anymore." I found my voice, a ragged whisper. I don't know you." For the first time, he looked directly at me. Up close, his face was a roadmap of a hard life. But his expression wasn't cruel. It wasn't kind either. It was just certain. "No," he agreed. "You don't." "Then why?" The question tore out of me. Why would this ghost of a man, this town legend, step into the middle of my ruin? Something flickered in his eyes. "Because no one else will." The simple, brutal truth of it hit me harder than any of the Hendersons' insults. I glanced at the faces in the crowd, my neighbors, my so-called friends. Not one had offered a hand. Not one had spoken a word. Only this stranger. "She's not going anywhere with you," Thomas blustered, finding a sliver of courage. "We know what kind of man you are, living alone out there. You think we'll just let you take a woman off like she's some stray calf?" Boone's voice dropped, becoming a low rumble that made the hairs on my arm stand up. "You stripped her bare in your yard like an animal at auction. You took her dignity, her home, her name, and now you have the gall to speak of what you'll let happen?" The crowd took a collective step back. This was something different. This wasn't just a family squabble anymore. This was a reckoning. Samuel, Thomas's smarter, quieter brother, stepped forward and put a hand on Thomas's arm. He recognized the precipice they were standing on. "The woman makes her own choice," Samuel said, his voice careful. "That's only proper." Every eye in Clearwater Junction turned to me. The naked woman in a stranger's coat, the fallen widow, the town scandal, and I had a choice. Stay here in this town that had watched my humiliation and done nothing, and become a ghost, a cautionary tale mothers would whisper to their daughters. Or go with him, a man of shadow and rumor, into an unknown future. It wasn't a choice at all. I looked straight at Martha, my voice shaking but clear. "I'll need my things." "You have nothing," she spat. Boone cut her off, his voice like Rolling Stones. "Her mother's Bible, her wedding ring, a photograph, whatever clothes she can fit in one bag. You'll give her that much, or we'll stand here until the sun sets and rises again." Reverend Garrett finally squeaked from the edge of the crowd. "It's only Christian, Martha. Let the woman have her personal effects." Martha's face twisted in defeat. She jerked her head at her daughter. "One bag. Catherine, you go with her. Make sure she doesn't steal anything." The walk back to the house felt 100 miles long. Inside, the room I had shared with James felt alien. I moved like a sleepwalker, gathering the fragments of my life. The worn Bible, the thin gold ring, a faded picture of my parents, 2 old dresses, my boots, my grandmother's comb. It all fit in a small carpet bag with room to spare. When I stepped back into the yard, Boone was waiting, a silent sentinel. He took the bag, tied it to his saddle, and then swung himself up onto his horse with an easy grace that defied his size. He reached down a massive, calloused hand. This was it, the final moment. Once I took that hand, there was no going back. The life I had known, the woman I had been, would be gone forever. I took his hand. He lifted me as if I weighed nothing, settling me in front of him on the saddle. His arm came around me to hold the reins, a solid, living wall at my back. It was scandalous. It was shocking. And I didn't care. I had moved beyond shame into some new wild territory. "This isn't over, Boone," Thomas yelled after us as the big horse began to walk. "We'll see the sheriff. We'll have the law on you for kidnapping." Boone didn't even look back. But I did. I took one last look at the Hendersons, their faces contorted with rage and thwarted power. I looked at the townspeople, their expressions a mixture of awe and guilty fascination. Not one of them looked sorry to see me go. As we rode out of town, I could hear the whispers starting up again, a wildfire of gossip that would burn for weeks. The widow McKenna stripped bare and carried off by the mountain hermit. I didn't know where he was taking me. I didn't know what would happen next. But as I leaned back against the solid strength of him and pulled his coat tighter, I knew one thing with bone-deep certainty. Anything was better than what I was leaving behind. I had been stripped of everything. But in that emptiness, for the first time in a long time, there was a flicker of something that felt terrifyingly like hope. And as the last building of Clearwater Junction disappeared behind us, I realized he hadn't just rescued me from the Hendersons. He had rescued me from a life that was already over. The prairie swallowed us whole. The silence was vast, broken only by the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves and the sigh of the wind through the tall grass. The mountains, which had always been a distant purple smudge on the horizon, grew larger and clearer with every mile, their peaks still capped with snow even in the summer heat. I sat stiffly at first, acutely aware of the man behind me, of the heat of his body, the solid presence of his arm. But as the miles wore on, exhaustion began to win. My body slowly relaxed into his, a silent surrender. He smelled of dust and leather and something clean, like pine needles after a rain. He rode like a man born in the saddle, guiding the horse with subtle shifts of weight, his hands gentle on the reins. He chose the smoothest paths, avoiding rocks and ruts, as if he knew my feet were still bare and tender inside my worn boots. The sun began to bleed across the sky, painting the clouds in shades of orange and blood red. The emptiness of the land should have been frightening, but it wasn't. It felt clean. It felt like a fresh start. "How much farther?" I asked, my voice hoarse. His voice rumbled through his chest, a vibration against my back. "Another 2 hours, maybe 3. True to his word, we stopped by a creek as twilight settled, the air growing cool. He dismounted and helped me down. My legs almost gave out, and he steadied me with a hand on my elbow, releasing me the second I found my balance. His respect for my space was a quiet gift. He gave me privacy to wash my face and feet in the ice-cold water. It felt like I was washing away not just the dust of the road, but the filth of the day's humiliation. When I looked up, he was watching me, but he glanced away quickly, busying himself with the horse. "Got some jerky and hardtack," he said, his back still to me. "Not much, but it'll do." My stomach growled, but the memory of my nakedness flashed in my mind. The heavy coat was still my only real covering. I I should dress properly," I stammered. He retrieved my bag without a word and set it on a flat rock. Then he walked upstream, disappearing behind a thicket of cottonwoods, giving me the space I needed. I pulled on one of my old dresses, the faded calico feeling like a suit of armor. I laced my boots, combed the tangles from my hair, and when I finally felt like a person again, I called out to him. We ate in silence as the first stars appeared, a careful distance between us. The jerky was tough, the hardtack tasteless, but it was the best meal I'd had in months. "Why did you really help me?" I asked, the question I'd been holding back for hours. He chewed a piece of jerky for a long moment, considering. "Man shouldn't stand by and watch cruelty, not if he can do something about it. Most men would have." "I'm not most men," he said simply. No, he certainly wasn't. We rode on into the gathering dark, climbing now into the foothills. The air grew cooler, scented with pine. I found myself thinking about his reputation, the whispers in town, a dangerous man, a man with a dark past. You came to town for supplies, I said, a thought suddenly striking me. But you left with nothing. I felt him shrug behind me. Plans change. The simple statement hit me with the force of a physical blow. He had given up his own needs, his own plans, for me, a total stranger. Why? The question beat in my mind like a drum. It had to be more than just a sense of duty. As we crested a high ridge, he spoke again, his voice quiet in the vast darkness. James was a good man. Didn't deserve a family like that. My blood ran cold. You? You knew my husband? There was a long pause. The horse picked its way carefully along the narrow trail. Knew him. Boone's voice was low, laced with something I couldn't identify. Regret, anger. Yeah, you could say that. I knew him better than they ever did. 1,000 questions exploded in my mind. How did he know James? Why had James never mentioned him? What secrets was this silent mountain man hiding? Before I could ask, he pointed ahead. Almost there. In the valley below, nestled against the dark bulk of the mountains, a single light glowed in the window of a small cabin. It looked like the loneliest place on earth, or maybe the safest. I looked at the light, then at the silhouette of the man holding me, and a chilling thought crept in. I hadn't been rescued by a stranger at all. I had been brought here, on purpose, and I had no idea why. The ranch was not the rough camp of a wild hermit. It was a proper homestead, a sturdy log cabin, a well-built barn, neat fences enclosing pastures where the shapes of cattle and horses moved in the moonlight. Everything was orderly, purposeful, built to last. This was the work of a man who hadn't abandoned civilization, but had built his own, better version of it. 2 dogs barked a welcome, their tails wagging as Boone helped me down from the horse for the last time. My legs were numb, my mind reeling from his revelation. He knew James. He knew him well. Come on, he said, taking my bag. You need rest. The inside of the cabin was Spartan but spotless. A stone fireplace, a simple table and 2 chairs, shelves lined with supplies. He pointed to a closed door. Bedroom's through there. You take it. I'll sleep out here. I can't take your bed, I protested, my voice weak. You can and you will, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He left to tend to the horse before I could say another word. I stood in the middle of the silent cabin, feeling like I'd landed on another planet. How had this happened? How had I gone from being a pariah in Clearwater Junction to a guest in the home of a man who held the keys to my late husband's secrets? The bedroom was small and clean. A quilt that looked hand-stitched was folded neatly on the bed. A small washstand stood in the corner. As I set my bag down on a wooden chest at the foot of the bed, my fingers brushed against something carved into the lid. I leaned closer, tracing the shape in the dim light. It was a small bird, a wren, its head cocked to one side. My breath caught in my throat. I fumbled in my bag, my hands shaking, and pulled out my grandmother's old tortoiseshell comb. Tucked inside the case was a tiny worn piece of wood, a small carving of a wren, identical to the one on the chest. James had carved it for me on our first anniversary. He'd told me it was a one-of-a-kind piece, something he'd whittled just for me. But here was its twin. I sank onto the bed, the 2 wooden birds in my trembling hands, one from my dead husband, the other in the home of the stranger who had saved me. It was impossible. It made no sense. Unless James had been here before, unless he and Elias Boone weren't just acquaintances. I looked around the small, masculine room. His room, a rifle on the wall, a stack of books on a small table, the Bible, Shakespeare, a worn copy of something called Walden, and on the bedside table, a framed photograph turned face down. My heart hammered against my ribs. I had no right. It was an invasion of his privacy. But I had to know. With a trembling hand, I reached out and turned the picture over. It wasn't a picture of a woman or a family. It was 2 men standing shoulder to shoulder in front of an unfinished cabin. This cabin. They were younger, grinning at the camera. One was a leaner, less weathered Elias Boone. The other was my husband, James. They weren't just friends. The way they stood, the easy camaraderie in their smiles. It was something deeper. They looked like brothers, partners, and I had never heard Elias Boone's name cross my husband's lips. Not once. For 3 years I had been married to a man who was living a secret life, a life that involved this man, this cabin, this valley, and the Hendersons. Did they know? Was their cruelty born of something more than just disappointment in a barren daughter-in-law? I put the picture back, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and betrayal. Elias hadn't just stumbled upon my humiliation. He'd sought me out. He had come to town for a reason that had everything to do with me, and nothing to do with supplies. He had saved me, yes, but he had also brought me to the heart of a mystery I never knew existed. I was a pawn in a game I didn't understand, and the man sleeping on the other side of the door was the only one who knew the rules. Sleep was impossible. I lay on the bed, fully clothed, listening to the wind sighing in the pines, feeling the cold weight of the carved bird in my hand. I had escaped one prison only to find myself in another, this one built of secrets and lies, and I was more alone than ever. The next morning I woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. I felt different. The shock had given way to a cold, hard resolve. I was done being a victim. I was done being a pawn. I was going to get answers. I found Elias by the corral, working with a young mare. He moved with a quiet patience that was mesmerizing, gentling the horse not with force, but with stillness. He was a man who understood trust. It was a bitter irony. He acknowledged me with a nod. "There's breakfast on the stove." "We need to talk," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. He turned from the horse, giving me his full attention. His winter sky eyes were impossible to read. "All right." I led the way back to the cabin, my heart pounding. I sat at the table, the same table where I now realized James must have sat, and waited for him. I placed the two carved wrens side by side in the center of the table. He came in, poured himself a cup of coffee, and sat opposite me. He looked at the birds, then at me. He didn't seem surprised. He seemed resigned. "You knew him," I said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "How? Why did he never speak of you?" He took a long sip of coffee, his gaze fixed on the birds. "Because the Hendersons could never know. About me. About this place." He began to talk, and the story that unfolded shattered the world I thought I knew. Elias and James had met years ago on a cattle drive. They'd become fast friends, bonded by a shared dream of building a ranch of their own, away from the grasping, controlling influence of James's family. This valley, this ranch, it was their dream. They'd bought the land together, built this cabin with their own hands during the summers, when James was supposedly on long buying trips. It was his escape, his real life. He was going to leave them, Elias said, his voice low. He was planning to tell them after the harvest was in. He was going to come here, for good. "And me?" I whispered, my throat tight. "Was I part of this plan?" "You were the whole point of it," he said, finally looking at me. "He wanted to bring you here, to a place where you could be free of them, where you could have a life. He talked about you all the time, said you were like a wildflower trying to grow in a rock pile." Tears pricked my eyes. The husband I'd been mourning was a stranger, but this man, this secret dreamer, felt more real than the one I'd known. "But he died," I said, the words tasting like ash. "A riding accident." Elias's jaw tightened. He looked away, out the window toward the mountains. That's the story they told. A cold dread snaked its way up my spine. "You don't believe it was an accident?" He was silent for a long time. "James was the best horseman I ever knew. He wouldn't have been thrown by a spooked horse, not on a trail he'd ridden 100 times. The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture of pure evil. The Hendersons' obsessive cruelty. Their desperation to get me out of the house. It wasn't just because I was a useless widow. It was because I was a loose end. I was the last link to a man whose secrets they wanted buried forever. "They killed him," I breathed, the horror of it sucking the air from my lungs. "I can't prove it," Elias said, his voice grim. "But in my gut, I know it. Thomas always hated that James had a life outside their ranch. He was jealous and greedy. He wanted James's share of the inheritance. He explained that he'd come to town that day to find me, to see if I was safe. He'd been watching the Henderson house for 2 days, trying to figure out a way to approach me without raising suspicion. Then he'd seen the crowd gathering in the yard. When I saw what they were doing to you, he shook his head, a muscle clenching in his jaw. I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I had to get you out of there. So my rescue hadn't been an act of random kindness. It was the fulfillment of a promise made to his dead friend. I looked at this quiet, solitary man. He had been grieving alone for 6 months, suspecting the worst, unable to act. He had carried the weight of their shared dream and the horror of James's probable murder all by himself. "Why didn't you tell me any of this last night?" I asked. "I didn't know if I could trust you," he said, his honesty blunt but not unkind. "I didn't know what they'd told you, what you believed. For all I knew, you were one of them." "Never," I said fiercely. He nodded slowly. "I see that now." A new, terrifying thought surfaced. If they killed James to protect their secrets, they won't just let me disappear. They'll come looking for me. "Yes," he said, his eyes as hard as flint. "They will." The safe little valley suddenly felt like a trap. We weren't just hiding. We were waiting for a war to arrive on our doorstep. The Hendersons hadn't just stripped me of my dignity. They had stolen my husband, his future, our future. And now they wanted to erase me, the last person who could ever uncover the truth. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice trembling. Elias stood up and walked to the door, looking out at the mountains that surrounded us. "First you learn to shoot. Then we make a plan. They started this fight, Sarah." He turned to look at me, and for the first time I saw the fire burning behind his winter sky eyes. "But we are going to finish it." The days that followed were a blur of purpose. The grief and confusion I felt were channeled into a cold, burning anger. Elias was a patient teacher. He started me with the rifle, showing me how to hold it, how to breathe, how to squeeze the trigger without flinching. The first time I hit the tin can he'd set on a fence post, a jolt of power shot through me. It was a feeling I'd never known before. I was no longer helpless. We fell into a routine born of necessity. We worked the ranch from sunrise to sunset, strengthening fences, securing the barn, and always watching the paths that led back to Clearwater Junction. The silence between us was no longer one of strangers, but of allies. We were two people bound together by a dead man's dream and a shared, dangerous enemy. One afternoon, as we were clearing rocks from a field he planned to plant with corn, he told me more about James. He told me about their plans to raise the finest horses in the territory, about James's secret love for books, about his frustration with his family's relentless focus on money and power. I was learning more about my husband in death than I had ever known in life. "He wanted this for you," Elias said, wiping sweat from his brow. "A place where your hands could be in the dirt, where you could have a garden that wasn't beholden to anyone. He said you had a gift for making things grow." A memory surfaced, so vivid it made me gasp. A few months before he died, James had given me a small packet of seeds. "For your dream garden," he'd said with a sad smile. "Someday." At the time, I thought it was just a sweet, empty gesture. Now I understood. He was giving me a piece of the future he was trying to build for us. I still had those seeds in my bag. That night, a new determination filled me. This wasn't just Elias's ranch anymore. It was mine too. It was the legacy James had left for me, and I would fight for it. A week later, Elias announced he had to go to town. "We're low on flour and salt, and I need to hear what the talk is. See if the Hendersons have made a move." Fear coiled in my stomach. "It's too dangerous." "More dangerous to be blind," he said. "I'll be careful. Stay here, keep the dogs close, and don't hesitate to use that rifle if you see anyone who isn't me." The 2 days he was gone were the longest of my life. The silence of the valley felt oppressive, every snap of a twig in the woods sounding like a threat. I practiced with the rifle until my shoulder was bruised and my hands were steady. I patrolled the property with the dogs, my senses on high alert. When I saw the dust cloud on the trail announcing his return, I nearly collapsed with relief. He looked tired as he unhitched the wagon. "The whole town is buzzing with the story," he said grimly. They're painting you as a fallen woman and me as the devil who spirited you away. The Hendersons are playing the part of the grieving, wronged family. Did they mention the sheriff? I asked. They tried to file a complaint for kidnapping, he said, a grim smile touching his lips. Sheriff Murphy laughed them out of his office. Told them a man who'd do what they did in a public yard had no right to call on the law for help. A small victory, but a victory nonetheless. But then his expression darkened. That's not all. Thomas has been asking questions, hiring a few rough-looking men from out of town. He's looking for me. He's looking for us. The war was no longer coming. It was here. There was something else, Elias said, pulling a letter from his coat pocket. This was waiting for me at the post office. It's from a lawyer in Cheyenne. My heart hammered as he opened it. He read it in silence, his face growing harder with every line. When he was done, he handed it to me. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was clear. It was a notice of probate. A lawyer had uncovered a second will belonging to James Henderson, a will that had been filed secretly in Cheyenne months before his death. This will left his entire share of the Henderson family inheritance not to his wife, but to his business partner, Elias Boone, and it named me, Sarah McKenna, as the sole beneficiary of the partnership should anything happen to both of them. It was a bombshell. James had legally cut his family out. He had protected his dream, protected Elias, and in doing so, had tried to protect me. They must have found out about this, I whispered, the paper trembling in my hand. That's why they killed him. It wasn't just jealousy, it was for the money. And it's why they have to find you, Elias finished, his voice like ice. This will make you a witness. More than that, it gives you a legal claim. You're not just a loose end anymore, Sarah. You're a threat to their entire fortune. The will was a weapon James had left for us from beyond the grave. But it was also my death warrant. The Hendersons wouldn't just come with threats now. They would come with guns. They would come to silence me forever. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The valley was no longer a sanctuary. It was about to become a battleground. The will changed everything. We were no longer just defending a home. We were fighting for justice. We can't just wait for them to come to us, I said, the words feeling strange and powerful in my mouth. The woman I had been just weeks ago would never have dared to speak them. We have to take this to the sheriff. Elias nodded, his eyes grim. It's a long shot, a secret will against the word of the most powerful family in the county. But it's the only shot we have. The next morning we rode out at dawn, not in the slow-moving wagon, but on horseback, armed and alert. The journey to Clearwater Junction felt different this time. I was not a victim fleeing in shame, but a woman riding toward a confrontation with an ally at my side. We bypassed the main street, tying our horses behind the sheriff's office and entering through the back door. Sheriff Murphy was a stout, weary-looking man with a drooping mustache and intelligent eyes. He looked up from his paperwork, his expression shifting from surprise to caution when he saw us. "Boone, ma'am," he greeted us with a nod. "I had a feeling I'd be seeing you two sooner or later." We laid it all out for him. The secret partnership, the ranch, our suspicions about James's death, and finally the will. He read the document carefully, his brow furrowed. He read it a second time. When he finally looked up, his expression was serious. "This is explosive," he said, tapping the paper. "I've had my own suspicions about the Hendersons for years. Rumors of rustling, of pressuring smaller homesteaders to sell out. But I've never had anything solid to go on. They're careful." "They killed him, Sheriff," I said, my voice low but steady. "I know they did." "Knowing and proving are two different things, Mrs. McKenna," he said gently. "This will provide a motive, a strong one. But it's not proof of murder. Their lawyers would tear it apart in court, paint you as a bitter, hysterical woman, and Boone as a fortune hunter." My heart sank. The law, our one hope, was not enough. "But," the sheriff continued, leaning forward, "it's enough for me to start digging. Officially." He looked at Elias. "You say James was a good horseman?" "The best," Elias confirmed. "The man who found him, one of the Henderson ranch hands, said his saddle cinch was loose, claimed it must have been an accident. I never bought it. A man like your friend would check his cinch before he even thought of mounting. He stood up and began to pace his small office. The Henderson family is a rot that goes deep in this county. Maybe this is finally the chance to cut it out. He stopped and looked at us, his eyes hard. But you need to understand this makes you both targets. They find out you've been here, that this will exist. They will become very, very dangerous. He walked to a gun locker and took out a small silver star. He pinned it to Elias's duster. "What's this?" Elias asked, looking down at the deputy's badge. "Insurance," the sheriff said. "If they come for you on your land, you'll have the authority to meet them. It won't stop a bullet, but it makes whatever you have to do to defend yourselves legal." He then turned to me. "As for you, Mrs. McKenna, you have more courage than anyone gives you credit for. But stay out of sight. Let me handle this." We rode back to the valley with the weight of the sheriff's warning heavy on our shoulders. The badge on Elias's chest felt less like a shield and more like a target. We spent the next few days fortifying the ranch, turning our home into a small fortress. We boarded up windows, created firing positions in the barn loft, and stored extra water and ammunition in the cabin. The peaceful valley had become an armed camp. The waiting was the worst part. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching horses. The attack came not at night, as we expected, but in the brazen light of late afternoon. The dogs erupted first, their frantic barking a clear alarm. Elias grabbed his rifle and ran to the porch. I took up my position at the cabin window, my own rifle resting on the sill, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. 5 riders were coming down the pass. Thomas and Samuel Henderson in the lead, flanked by 3 of the hard-faced men we'd seen in town. They weren't coming to talk. They were coming to finish what they had started. They stopped just out of rifle range. "Boone!" Thomas yelled, his voice carrying on the wind. "We know you're in there. We've come for what's ours. The woman and the land." Elias stepped out onto the porch, the deputy's star glinting on his chest. "This land is mine, Henderson, and the woman is under the protection of the law. Turn back now." Thomas laughed, a raw, ugly sound. "That tin star won't help you now. We know about the will. You think you can steal my family's money?" So the lawyer had told them. The fuse was lit. "It was James's money to give," I shouted from the window, my voice shaking with rage. "The money you killed him for." The accusation hung in the air. Samuel shifted nervously in his saddle, but Thomas's face was a mask of fury. "You're dead," he screamed, pulling his pistol. "Both of you." And then all hell broke loose. The first shot came from one of the hired guns, splintering the doorframe next to Elias's head. He ducked back, firing a shot from his own rifle that sent one of the riders tumbling from his horse. Gunfire erupted from both sides. Lead slammed into the log walls of the cabin. I aimed my rifle as Elias had taught me, found Thomas in my sights, and fired. The shot went wide, but it was enough to make him dive for cover. They were trying to pin us down, to surround the cabin. One of the hired guns made a run for the barn. From the loft, where Elias had predicted they might try to go, one of the dogs let out a pained yelp, followed by a single gunshot. But it wasn't one of ours. Suddenly, a new figure appeared in the loft doorway. A grizzled man I recognized as Jake Morton, a neighboring rancher Elias had spoken of. He held a smoking rifle. He wasn't alone. 2 more ranchers appeared at the edge of the tree line, laying down covering fire. The sheriff had done more than just start digging. He had sent out a warning. The Hendersons were trapped. Their hired guns, seeing the tables had turned, began to fall back, firing wildly as they fled. Samuel screamed at his brother, "It's over, Thomas! We have to go!" But Thomas was consumed by a mad rage. He stood up from behind his cover and charged the cabin on foot, his pistol blazing. "She's mine! All of it is mine!" Elias stepped onto the porch, his own gun leveled. "It's over, Thomas! It's over when you're dead!" he shrieked. A single shot rang out. Not from Elias's gun. Thomas stopped. He looked down at his chest where a dark red stain was spreading rapidly. He looked up at me, in the window, my smoking rifle still in my hands. His expression was one of pure shock. Then he collapsed into the dust and was still. Silence descended on the valley, broken only by the whimpering of the wounded dog in the barn. It was over. But in that moment, Looking at the man I had just killed, I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel justice. I just felt a profound, soul-crushing emptiness. The violence of the Hendersons had finally consumed everything, including a part of me. The aftermath was a blur. Sheriff Murphy arrived with two deputies not long after the shooting stopped. They had been riding hard, alerted by Jake Morton, who had been keeping an eye on the pass for days. They took statements. They collected the bodies. Samuel Henderson was taken into custody, babbling a full confession in a mixture of terror and grief. He admitted everything: the conspiracy, the murder of his brother, the plan to kill us and destroy the will. The fight was over. The truth was out. Justice would be served. But as the sheriff and his men rode away, leading a handcuffed Samuel Henderson, a heavy silence settled over our valley. The setting sun cast long, blood-red shadows across the yard where a man lay dead by my hand. Elias came to me then. He gently took the rifle from my grasp and led me back inside the cabin. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't hold a cup of water. "You did what you had to do, Sarah," he said, his voice soft. "You defended our home. You defended yourself." "I killed a man, Elias." "No," he said, looking me straight in the eye. "You stopped a monster. There's a difference." He was right, I knew, but the knowledge didn't make the shaking stop. The violence of the last few weeks, culminating in that final terrible moment, had taken its toll. That night, for the first time, Elias didn't sleep on the floor. He sat in the chair by my bed, his rifle across his lap, and watched over me as I fell into a restless, nightmare-filled sleep. He was a guardian, a partner, a silent presence that kept the darkness at bay. In the weeks that followed, the valley slowly began to heal. Jake Morton and the other ranchers helped us repair the damage to the cabin and barn. The news from town was that Martha Henderson, broken by the death of one son and the imprisonment of the other, had sold the ranch and moved back east, a disgraced and ruined woman. The Henderson empire had crumbled to dust. The legal matters were settled quickly. With Samuel's confession and the evidence of the will, the court officially recognized Elias and me as the rightful owners of James's share of the estate. We were, by the standards of the territory, wealthy, but the money felt like blood money. We used it to buy more land, to build the finest herd of horses in the county, fulfilling the dream that James and Elias had shared. We built a legacy, not of power and greed, but of hard work and integrity. The seasons turned. The scars on the log cabin faded, and the scars on my soul began to heal too. The rhythm of the ranch was a soothing balm, the smell of new-mown hay, the warmth of a newborn calf, the steady, quiet companionship of the man at my side. Our partnership deepened into something more. It was a love born not of sudden passion, but forged in fire and crisis. It was built on a foundation of mutual respect, shared loss, and the quiet understanding of two people who had seen the worst of the world and chosen to build something better. One evening in the spring, a year after that terrible day in the Hendersons' yard, we were sitting on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains. The valley was bursting with new life. My garden, planted with the seeds James had given me, was a riot of color. "James would have loved this," I said quietly. "He would have," Elias agreed. He took my hand, his calloused fingers lacing through mine. "He wanted you to be happy, Sarah, to be safe." "I am," I said, and I realized with a sudden joyful clarity that it was true. "I'm both." He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to me, his winter sky eyes filled with a warmth that I'd come to cherish. "The ranch needs more than just partners to run it right," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It needs a family." He got down on one knee, there on the porch of the home we had fought for, and looked up at me. "Sarah McKenna, you are the strongest, bravest woman I have ever known. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears welled in my eyes, not of sorrow or fear, but of pure, unadulterated joy. This man who had seen me at my absolute lowest, stripped of everything, now saw me as his everything. "Yes," I whispered. "Yes, Elias. Of course, yes." We were married in our valley, surrounded by the friends who had stood by us. Sheriff Murphy was there, and Jake Morton, and the other ranchers who had come to our aid. We stood under the open sky, the mountains our witnesses, and pledged our lives to each other. As I stood there, holding my husband's hand, I thought about the woman I had once been, the timid, heartbroken widow who thought her life was over. She would never have recognized the woman I was now, a rancher, a partner, a survivor. I had been stripped of everything, cast out with nothing. But in that emptiness, I had found my true strength. I had learned that dignity isn't something others can give you or take away. It's something you claim for yourself. And sometimes the greatest love doesn't come from a whirlwind romance, but from the steady hand of a man who offers you his coat in your darkest hour and simply says, "You're coming with me." My life was not the one I had planned, but it was so much more than I had ever dreamed. It was a life I had chosen, a life I had fought for, and it was just beginning. Thank you for listening to this story of survival and justice in the Old West. It's a powerful reminder that even after the most devastating storms, new life can and will grow. What part of Sarah's journey resonated with you the most? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, please make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss our next tale from the untamed frontier. Your support helps us keep these incredible stories alive. Until next time, stay strong and keep fighting.